We need to have a standardized of pharmaceutical reps.
The people that provide education to doctors.
Who is the chairman and CEO.
The fascination the public has.
The impact on society, the impact on unemployment.
What was consistent was the focus on patients, and I quickly became very amazed at just the great work that the industry was doing, and I started my MSL job.
So the average drug launch fails over 50% of the time. And a recent study found that field medical affairs or medical science liaisons are one of the top predictors of success for a successful drug launch. What this tells us is that putting strong medical affairs leaders at the helm is critical to a pharmaceutical company's overall success. Today, we're really happy to welcome Dr. Shontelle Dodson, who's the Executive Vice President and Head of Global Medical Affairs at Astellas Pharma. Shontelle is a pharmacist by training with several years of experience working directly with patients, also being involved in clinical development, and now leads a leading medical affairs organization, one of the top pharma companies in the industry. She's also recognized as a National Healthcare Businesswomen Association Rising Star, and she was a recipient of the Astellas Vision Award. She's been a champion for advancing women in science and medicine. And as we're going to talk about, her leadership really reflects a commitment to science, equity, and better access to care, which you guys know that I'm really passionate about. So Shontelle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Will. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you. So I'm going to start out with a statistic that I'd love to kind of get your take on. So the ACMA conducted a study a few years ago, which found that 72% of pharmacists said they actually weren't prepared by their colleges of pharmacy to work in the industry, to work as medical science liaisons or work in medical affairs. Now, you started your career as a pharmacist. Maybe talk us a little bit about that transition, what it was like starting out as a pharmacist and then going into industry, and what made you decide to go to industry?
Thank you. You know, that statistic doesn't surprise me at all, because when I graduated from pharmacy school, I did a residency, a postdoctoral residency. I knew nothing about industry and what the opportunities were in industry. I was really focused at that time on getting clinical experience. And I was very fortunate to work in a leading academic teaching hospital where I was directly involved in patient care and really experienced that firsthand, and really made me passionate about being there for patients, helping patients and helping them achieve better outcomes. During that, I also had the opportunity to interact with representatives from the industry and started to learn about the pharmaceutical industry. And this was quite a long time ago, but at that time, you mentioned MSLs, those jobs were just becoming new jobs in the industry. Yeah. And the representative of a major pharmaceutical company came to me and said, "Hey, Shontelle, we're going to start this new organization called Medical Science Liaisons. Would you be interested in applying for one of these positions?" And naive, early in my career, I said, "Well, sure, let me take a look and do that." And it all started from there. It was a big transition for me initially. I was working in that teaching hospital. We were affiliated with a VA hospital. And so I was going from, a government-based care system for a for-profit company, which is a very, very different transition. But what was consistent was the focus on patients and the impact that I could make on patients in this new organization at an even broader level. And I quickly became, very amazed at just the great work that the industry was doing. And I started my MSL job, and honestly, I've never looked back from there. It's been a great career for me.
So a lot of people listening, they are probably familiar with, what a pharma rep is. They know the friendly pharma sales rep who comes in, brings lunch to the office and, gives samples. But a lot of people don't necessarily know what a medical science liaison is or what medical affairs does. So for those that are listening out there that maybe aren't familiar with the differences, can you maybe kind of shed some light on that?
Sure. Medical affairs is a unique part of an organization. We sit at the intersection between development and the commercialization efforts of a company. And our remit is really to ensure that, number one, we understand the healthcare environment, the landscape. We understand the patient journey. And we understand for our products that we're developing and bringing to the market, or that we have on the market, where there are gaps in our data, where there's gaps in the knowledge around our data. And it's our remit to be able to generate data that can help close those knowledge gaps, and or safety information that helps people better understand and better utilize our products, disseminate that data, and that dissemination can be in a lot of different formats. It can be with an MSL that we talked about, who's actively engaging in scientific exchange with leading experts, with payers, with policymakers around the world. It can be through journal publications in major medical journals. It can be with medical education events that the pharma companies support. And that remit really is what medical affairs does across the board, with looking at it from a lot of different angles. A medical science liaison, we have medical directors, we have people who answer medical information questions, and a lot of different scientists involved in the medical affairs process.
Yeah, so for the folks listening out there, many of you know that I worked within medical affairs for many years. I headed up medical affairs teams, and I think people who maybe aren't as familiar with the industry don't realize that actually the pharmaceutical companies, to their credit, they've built this division to make sure that the information that goes out, to your point, is objective, right? It's objective information. MSLs, medical affairs professionals, don't have sales goals. So when they're working with the key opinion leaders, it really is a collaboration, and they're really trying to put out information that is objective, and it really is more coming from an educational kind of perspective, with that spirit of collaborating at a research level, whether it's looking at opportunities to think about other ways to utilize the product or expand the indication, but it's not sales. And so for those of you that are listening out there, I think this is a really important distinction, because the MSLs are really out there educating the physicians, helping them inform them ultimately to make better clinical decisions. Would you agree with that summary?
100% agree, Will. And I know that you and your organization, you've been very passionate about that, as are we, ensuring that we ethically, in a non-biased, balanced way, provide information around all treatments, honestly, for a given disease area. We can go in depth and answer questions about our respective treatment, but we want to make sure that ultimately the decision is for the prescriber. We just want to give them the information to make the best decision for the patient, so that the patient has the best possible outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm sure you've heard this, and I've heard this over the years. Matter of fact, last week I was at Fierce Pharma in Philadelphia, and I was on one of the panels speaking, and I know, and this topic keeps coming up over and over and over again. I've been hearing this topic for the last, 10 to 15 years, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on it, which is this: we as medical affairs need to have a seat at the table. We as medical affairs need to be part of the strategy. And I don't notice that comes up with other areas, let's say with commercial, whether it's on the market access side or on the sales side or other areas in clinical. Why is it that you think this is still an issue where medical affairs feels like they have to continue to kind of, I guess, promote that idea that they need to have a seat at the table? Don't they already have a seat at the table?
They do. And I think there's a couple of things that drive that. One, I think if you think about a development organization and a commercial organization, the remit is very clear for both of those organizations, meaning that the development organization will develop a product that gets approved. The commercial organization will promote that product to generate revenue for that product. Medical affairs spans that and doesn't have just one single deliverable, right? We have data generation, we have data dissemination, scientific engagement. And I think sometimes it's challenging for people to understand, because that remit is so broad, and that connection that the medical affairs organization plays is sometimes complex to be able to describe to people. Now, we're very fortunate in our organization where people absolutely see the important value of medical affairs, because medical affairs is customer facing. We are out there in the world and in these academic centers, understanding what's going on in the patient journey. What are the challenges that healthcare providers are facing that we as a pharma company can help solve by providing more information on our products? And in our organization, we've taken an approach for our brands that we have co-leadership of our brands now. This was a change for us about a year ago. And we have both medical affairs and commercial co-leading and co-accountable for the overall brand. Now, I want to be clear that medical affairs has no accountability for profitability, revenue, sales targets, but the overall performance of the brand and the patient access to that brand and the ability for patients to be able to achieve, positive outcomes is equally important. And so that's a change that we've really been making purposefully, so that we can continue to elevate the importance of medical affairs. And I'll tell you that, across our organization, people definitely see the value, but it has been an ongoing challenge for medical affairs for many years. It shouldn't be.
Well, I commend you for doing that. That's a great model, this co-leadership model. And you touched on something that I think is really important, which is about the outcomes. To your point, with development, it's clear what the remit is, or with sales on the commercial side. Talk to me a little bit about, at Astellas, how do you guys measure the success for medical affairs, or just in general, beyond the traditional metrics, let's say of, patients enrolled in a study, or looking at the number of interactions? What would you say meaningfully signals value to your cross-functional partners, but also to patients, providers, and so forth? So kind of what do you guys look at to say, yes, we've actually achieved our goals within medical affairs this year?
It's a lot of different things. And because there's not one single thing for medical affairs, it's often challenging. We have really tried to move the medical affairs organization to better being able to articulate the impact that a medical affairs activity has. So instead of traditionally medical affairs knowing that leading up to a launch, there's this list of 10 things that you have to do. Everybody knows you have to do these 10 things to prepare for the launch. What we're challenging the organization to do is, for any one of those given things, data generation. What is the ultimate impact you're trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve patient access, inclusion in the guidelines, more clarity on safety or efficacy information? And by really being able to describe that up front, then you can better be able to demonstrate the impact of that particular tactic over time. The other challenge with medical affairs is a lot of things that we do, a study takes multiple years. It's not like in the sales organization where, every month or every quarter that you can see results. So by focusing on impact and looking at measurements along the way, we can better be able to articulate that. Some of those measurements along the way may be things like completing the study, completing enrollment, but that's not the impact. The impact is down the road, and the impact is, were we able to get that information into treatment guidelines at that approval time period? That is an important impact versus 6 months later, or not even having the data and having to go do a study and you don't get it into the guideline until even longer. The same is true with things like publications, simultaneous publications, so that people around the globe, if they weren't at a Congress, will have access to that information in the timeliest manner. That's impact. And medical education. We've really become much more deliberate on measuring the impact of our medical education, because the truth is, we put a lot of effort into medical education activities, and we need to know whether they're effective or not, whether they're changing and filling knowledge gaps or changing treatment behaviors that impact patients. So we're much more deliberate about capturing that information now. So those are just a few of the examples of the way we measure impact.
Yeah, and I like how you thought about that and how you approach it, because I agree. I mean, at the end of the day, it's what is the impact long term in terms of whatever it is the activity is. So, for example, if you're measuring the number of interactions, for example, with a key opinion leader, or you're measuring how many publications you had out, it's not so much about that quantitative measure. It's ultimately, what does that mean in terms of whether it's the insights you've gathered from the community, the healthcare community, what that means to patients, what that means ultimately to how you can help to do a better job in diagnosing and treating the disease of interest. So I agree with that. And I think sometimes we miss that, right? And a lot of times when we kind of get in the weeds and we think about metrics, we're really focused on sometimes these quantitative metrics, but we don't think about the overall larger impact to the business or to our stakeholders and what that means in a positive way to them. So I definitely would agree with you there. Now, I know you've worked in market access. Am I correct?
I did. I actually have spent 4 years of my career, which was largely medical affairs, in the commercial organization, 2 of which of that was the market access organization.
Yes, and that's very unique for the people listening out there. A lot of people, who work within medical affairs, they kind of stay within a particular trajectory within their career. But I really was impressed by the fact that you worked on the market access side, because that probably gives you a very different perspective. Maybe for the folks that are listening out there, again, that aren't maybe familiar with field reimbursement or market access, maybe talk to them a little bit about what market access does in a pharmaceutical company.
Market access is such a critical role, because that is the role that really delivers access for patients, whether it's an HTA provider in a European country, or whether within the United States, it's one of the insurance companies, payers in the United States. It's really working with those organizations, also with medical affairs, not just with the market access commercial colleagues, but helping them understand the value that this product brings to a patient. Meaning that, does it take cost out of the healthcare system? Do you have better efficacy? Is there better safety? And so the market access organizations work with payers to understand, what data do you need in order for us to be able to have formulary access for our product so that patients can access it? And then working within the organization to deliver that information. And it's a sometimes behind the scenes organization within pharma companies, but such a critical organization, because honestly, if patients don't have access through their payers, then they won't receive the positive benefits of treatment from our products.
Yes. Yeah, I think a lot of people, and I've talked about this a lot when I go on television or talk to journalists, they don't realize that actually pharma companies are trying very hard to make sure that patients have access to the medications, right? I mean, we have these field reimbursement teams, we have the market access, and we at the ACMA, we're the organization behind the PACS program, the Prior Authorization Certified Specialist program. And why do companies actually come and get trained and certified through us? Because they want to go out and help their offices ultimately to streamline access for patients. It's important. And even a lot of the healthcare systems will come to us and they'll train their prior authorization specialists there in the office. Why? Because they want to make sure that patients have the access that they need. So I think sometimes it's a misnomer to think that pharma is trying to put some things in place to stifle access. Actually, the opposite. And I'm not saying this because I'm a former pharma executive, but I can tell you firsthand, they work really, really hard to make sure that patients have the access that they really need to get to these medications. Because remember, ultimately, for the pharmaceutical companies, selfishly, they want to see these patients treated, and they want to adhere to the therapies, because that's going to have better outcomes ultimately for the patient. So it benefits the patient, benefits the company, and it benefits healthcare providers. I was saying this the other day when I was on Fox News, I think on Tuesday, and I was talking to the anchor about prior auth denials. Prior auth denials are the number one reason for healthcare delay in the United States, which is terrible. It's terrible. So, and I'm sure you have stories. I have stories with my own family of patients who get denied care, and it's difficult. So I think the role of market access is really, really key. And like I said, I was impressed by the fact that you had that experience, because actually at Fierce Pharma last week, they had a session. It was called Market Access for Medical Affairs. It was all about teaching medical affairs about market access. I just thought that was a really good idea, because you don't really get that a lot, right, within medical necessarily. So I thought that was very, very important. Let's talk a little bit about that, about drug pricing, about some of the policies. This year especially, there's been a few policies that have come out, and a lot of the listeners always wonder about drug pricing. Why are the drugs so expensive? One of the things that the administration's tried to do this year in the White House is say, let's look at this idea of making sure that we're on par with other countries in terms of drug pricing, with the Most Favored Nations Policy Act. Now, with that, what are your thoughts about that? Maybe can you talk to the audience a little bit about why are some of the drug prices rather higher in the U.S. versus in other countries? What are some of the factors that are involved? Why is that the case? Because obviously the fact that we want to bring the cost down and make it at par with other countries tells us that our prices here are higher. So why is that? Maybe if you can kind of talk a little bit about that as it relates to how the U.S. healthcare system is structured.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I would say that our goal is, as you mentioned earlier, is for patients to have access to products that will improve and have a positive impact on their life. The U.S. has a very complicated healthcare system. I think most people don't realize how complex it is. And my time in market access really helped me to understand, nowhere else in the world do we have a middleman in the system. So the pharma does not sell our products directly to a patient. We, in some situations, have direct physician purchases, but generally speaking, it gets sold through a third party. An insurance company manages the access, and then a pharmacy actually delivers the product. And all along that pathway, there's money that comes out of the system. That's very different than what you see in other parts of the world. Now, other parts of the world severely limit access often to products so that patients can't get access to products, which is very different than the US healthcare system, where we do want to make sure that patients are getting access. So it's not a one size fits all. And I'm often challenged when somebody says, well, you know, the US prices are higher. It's true, and that oftentimes US prices are higher, but there's also restrictions outside the world that in other parts of the world where patients can't even get access to begin with. And I think we have to really holistically look at that. I would love to see some of the middleman costs come out of the system, because the truth is that those costs are not, those savings are not getting passed on to patients. And it's a significant misnomer that the price that is listed for a product by a pharmaceutical company is the price that we sell the product for. It's far from that. There are significant discounts, and our belief is that patients should receive that discount at the pharmacy counter, but that's not what's happening today, which is a big challenge.
I agree. And the other thing too that I would add to that is, remember that the innovation that the pharmaceutical industry has had over the last, century has been unbelievable. I was talking about this the other day to somebody that, think about the polio, right? The polio vaccine, smallpox. You think about a lot of the infectious diseases, the advent of insulin, even HIV, AIDS. I worked at Gilead Sciences. I mean, really, companies like Gilead, AbbVie, really helped to make people that have HIV or AIDS. It used to be a death sentence, and now you can live a normal lifespan. So yesterday, when I was talking to the president of the American Medical Association, Bobby Mukamala, he was talking to me about a situation that he had. He was diagnosed with a brain tumor, and he had access to this drug veratinib. Had he not had access to it, he would have unfortunately died. And he was talking about how this drug basically sustains his life. Those innovations are really, really, really important. And obviously the investment back into R&D is critical. So I think, again, for a lot of people listening out there, there's sometimes this misinformation that pharma is, this big bad guy trying to do the wrong thing. But I got to tell you, again, from my experience, most people in the industry, of course, you always have bad apples. You have bad apples in any industry. But for the most part, people really are trying to make sure that they're furthering the innovation and trying to do the right thing for patients. And I think that's really important to know. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, as we go back to kind of medical affairs and about standards, and I don't know if you know this, but one of the things that we do at the ACMA, we talk to a lot of people on Capitol Hill. I've talked to a lot of folks in Congress. I've met with the FDA many times. Matter of fact, I'm now scheduling a meeting with Marty McCary to talk about this. But one of the things the FDA is really big on is standards for pharmaceutical industry professionals. In 2021, we went before Congress. We had a briefing before Congress and the U.S. Healthcare Subcommittee to talk about this. You and I both know that we're in an industry that's very complex, very fast moving. How important, Shontelle, do you think it is to establish a common language or baseline level of competency, let's say across field medical? I mean, we do it with board certification. We think that's really important, which has now become prime time. But how important do you think that is to kind of have a benchmark or a standard to make sure that everybody is operating at a minimum level of competency?
I think that's absolutely important, Will, and I commend you guys for what you've done in that area around certifications, because we also feel that's very important. And internally, we have our own certification process that we put people through, because we want our medical colleagues, our medical affairs colleagues, to have an in-depth understanding of the science, an in-depth understanding of our data, full understanding of the statistics behind the data, and being able to have those conversations at a minimum standard level is absolutely critical, because it represents us as a company. The other thing that we've put a lot of standard around is how we develop our protocols and the scientific rigor that we put into that and the review that we put into that. Because as a company, we only want to deliver the highest scientific rigor in the data that we deliver. We don't want shortcuts, because that's important, and it reflects on our industry, and the entire industry is doing that. And I believe, as you mentioned, that the majority of the industry really upholds that level of standards. Then everybody benefits. The data is strong, patients benefit. But unfortunately, there have been some situations where there are outliers. They're very few, and I think that we just need to continue to upgrade and make sure that we're delivering at that level.
And I agree 100%. And one of the things that I'm interested to kind of get your take on, and I'm sure you're seeing this across not just pharma, but just across all industries, is this change that's happening with AI, right? And we've seen just even in the last 24 months, there's been a rapid uptake of the use of AI for people personally. Everybody's using ChatGPT for everything, right? Whether it's, I've got to figure out how to write this email more effectively, or I got into an argument with my spouse and I don't know how to respond. I've seen it all. As you look ahead in the next few years, how do you see AI impacting not just pharma, but healthcare overall? You're a healthcare provider, right? By training, how do you see AI changing how we do business in the life sciences?
It is an exciting time for AI. And, I have to admit, I've had to really push myself into it. But as I push myself into it, it is amazing. I mean, some of the things that it can do to make us more efficient, even simple things like you mentioned, like, helping you draft an email. We need to get to a place where we can better identify the patients that will benefit the most from our products, because the one thing the pharma company also wants to do is we don't want people to receive our products who aren't going to receive benefit. That doesn't help anybody. And so if we can use AI to better figure out who those patients are in whatever disease state, and enable and generate data so that those patients really are the patients that are treated with our products, I think AI can play a big role in that. AI can make us more efficient. When we submit large dossiers to regulators around the world, it is a significant amount of work, as you know, and it takes a lot of time. If we can shorten those time periods by utilizing AI and get our dossiers submitted in a quicker fashion, and if regulators around the world are able to use AI and review these dossiers at the same level of scrutiny, but in a quicker fashion, then ultimately, again, the patient wins. And that's what I'm excited about for, seeing with AI. For us, we're looking at things like study reports. How do we get study reports completed faster using AI to help us? How do we take a study report and get that information into a publication, and get that publication that might have taken 6 months to developed in 2 months and out there in the public, so that physicians around the world have access to that information and can use it to treat their patients? So I'm excited about the opportunity broadly for industry, but even specifically for medical affairs for AI.
I agree, and it's changing so quickly. The other day I learned about this new idea of organoid AI. Have you heard of this?
No.
This is unbelievable. So basically, there's these researchers that took the cells from the stem cells of a brain, and they took the cells, they put them in vitro in a petri dish, and they attached electrodes to the cells, and they were able to teach these cells. This was just this tissue, right? They were able to teach it how to play the tennis game from the 70s, Pong. I don't know if you remember that game, Pong, from back in the day, but they were able to teach it how to do it, right? This is unbelievable. So this is this concept of organoid AI, where you actually take living biological material, and then you are able to actually control and manipulate what those cells do. So in this case, the cells are able to do something very, very basic. This concept of biocomputing, which I found was really fascinating. It's not prime time yet, no one's using it, but I just thought it spoke to how quickly AI is, evolving. I mean, this is unbelievable. And there was another thing that I saw around hierarchical reasoning models, and, how AI, which right now mainly is agentic AI, but how it can become more augmented AI. So it can become much more human-like. So I think, we're seeing all these developments in AI that are happening very, very fast. And I agree. I think it's going to really change whether it's how physicians work with patients, whether it's around even just some of the workflows within a hospital system, and, on the pharma side as well. I've seen this the other day, so the ACMA, we have ACMA AI, which is basically an AI platform to help make organizations more efficient. And one of the things that we're being asked to do is to support with AdCom briefings. And this is really interesting. Now, for the folks that don't know, many times when pharmaceutical companies need to go out and meet with the FDA, they'll have an advisory committee meeting. We call them AdCom meetings, and that's where they go out and present data, to the FDA. I don't know if you've been part of those. I've been, and this is this concept of, could we use the AI to train the individuals to prepare for the advisory committee meeting? Have you heard of this before?
Absolutely, because we're trying to do something similar even with MSLs and help to train them. But go ahead.
Yes, yeah. So so we're doing that right with our AI, where we're training the MSLs using these simulators. But the advisory committee meeting was kind of something new that we really hadn't thought about as an application. So again, I just think things are going to change so rapidly. It's exciting. I think we have to have good guardrails, right? Because we've seen sometimes where AI can hallucinate, right, and that can provide misinformation. But it is exciting, nonetheless. What do you see, like, if I was to say, Shontelle, the next 5-10 years, within medical affairs, what are some of the big trends, maybe outside of AI, that you see?
Well, what I'd like to see is medical affairs taking an even greater leadership role, because we work in a high science industry, and that science is really important. And I think, ensuring that we're able to get the right information to the right person at the right time is critical. And that can be largely driven, by medical affairs. I would love to see that we're able to get answers to people faster, that there's more instantaneous access to the information, because far too often, for example, ESMO is coming up next month. There will be some really important, great data presented at ESMO. If you are attending ESMO, then you're going to have access to that data, but it can take 6 months, 9 months longer for people around the world to actually have access to that information. What if that access happens the same day that it's presented? How does that change patient care? If we can make that happen more in real time around the world, patients will benefit. And I really want to see us move to that in the pharmaceutical industry. Be able to develop drugs even faster, right? And be able to get important treatments to patients even faster. We can do it. I know that we can.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Did you see the FDA's notice a few months ago about the national priority vouchers and trying to accelerate drug development? So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on that? Because that's going to shorten, right, the launch time, right? That I would imagine that pharma companies are going to have. What do you think about that?
I think there's a lot still that needs to be unpacked in that we don't quite know the answers to yet. There have been voucher type programs in the past that have been able to be utilized. There's a lot of caveats around vouchers. So I think it's great if we can do that. The great thing is in oncology right now, you see a lot of speed in approval, which is nice. And if we can expand that to other parts of the FDA, that will be great. But right now, I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but great to see that momentum moving forward to be able to move faster.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to be positive overall. Let's shift gears to pharmacists. You're a pharmacist by training. For the pharmacists that are listening out there, that are, thinking about working in the pharmaceutical industry, they're not sure where to start or what to do. What advice would you have for them? What can they expect?
Well, I think the first thing is to network and learn and get to know what opportunities there are in the industry, because there are a lot of opportunities. Every month I meet with PharmD students that we have rotating through our organization, and pharmacy schools in general don't teach a lot about industry. They're hearing more and more about it now than they ever have. When I was in pharmacy school, I didn't even really know industry existed beyond, going to a pharmacy and where the drugs came from. But I really want to challenge upcoming pharmacy students to get out there and learn, because it's such a great profession. It's such a patient-oriented profession, and your understanding of the patient is so critical within the pharmaceutical industry, coupled with your understanding of the science, and then also coupled with the fact that as a pharmacist, you're part of a team and you're a team player, and really being able to solve for patients. That's a great characteristic in our industry, because we work as teams in this industry. And I think a pharmacist is well positioned in a lot of different roles. And I mean, I could name 15 roles off the top of my head that pharmacists could do in the industry. It's a great opportunity.
Yeah,
I've done a lot of
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, back in the day when I started in the industry in 1999, and there was nothing. Obviously, there's really nothing out there in terms of resources about MSLs or medical affairs. And I only knew because I had met a girl who was working at Eli Lilly, And I was, so my background, I'm a PhD, but my background, I'm a biochemist. And she said, you'd be great at working in the pharma industry. And I was like, doing what in the pharma industry? I wasn't familiar. And that's really how I learned. That's how I found out about it.
Yeah.
And the rest is history. What legacy do you want to leave behind? So, you've built an amazing career. What do you want your legacy to be, Shontelle?
I really want it to be about other people. First and foremost, that we as an organization delivered for patients and we made an impact for patients. I feel incredibly blessed to be working in an organization that not just one, but multiple products that have changed the standard of care in their respective disease areas and are still changing the standard of care, which is improving patients' lives. And being able to say that, by working in a career for 25, 30 years and making a difference for patients is what's really important to me, because I share a lot of time my why and why I do this. And my why, it gets personal with patients in my family and my direct family have been impacted by these diseases, and being able to see firsthand the advances in the pharmaceutical industry and how we benefited from them. And then I would say the second thing is I'm very passionate about giving back to upcoming leaders and making my time available. I mentioned I talked to pharmacy students. I talked to 2 of them yesterday. I really keep my door open to really help people navigate their career path and share my learnings. My answers may not always be right, but I want to help lift them up and challenge them to be a lifelong learner, to really look, how can I improve and how can I get better? How can I become a better leader? And if I can, leave behind just a legacy of helping to develop people that ultimately, become successful in their own right, that's great for me. That makes me happy.
Shontelle Dodson, I really enjoyed this conversation. I could tell you're very passionate about the industry and patients and the students, and I love it. I could just tell it emanates from you. I really enjoyed the discussion. I really enjoyed having you on the podcast. Shontelle Dodson, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate it.